I think war has always been, in the history of capitalism, the final resort when you could not solve your problem another way. It's understood that way by the military. It's understood that way by the people who lead capitalism. I would urge you to understand, war doesn't begin with capitalism, obviously. It's ancient Greece and all of the rest. But capitalism has to its name an extraordinary achievement, which goes to an earlier question that Maria read. Capitalism produced the first genuine world wars. We never had that before, partly because capitalism created a world economy, a world market. The 20th century saw World War I and World War II. Together, those wars killed, directly and indirectly, 100 million people, 200 million people, an unspeakable number of people. And these were wars among capitalist countries fighting with one another for what they thought their survival depended on. In Germany, language like Lebensraum. In German, that means literally room to live. The Germans had to have room to live. That's why they had to take Poland or take Czechoslovakia or get back the colonies that the Germans had that were taken from them in World War I. They wanted to get them back in World War II. These countries got themselves to a point where in their minds, their survival as capitalist economies depended on the destruction of some enemy. And I think capitalism has always understood that the military has to be preserved, has to be funded, has to be maintained in that way. What is new, and what's really an American invention after World War II, was the permanent massive army. Before, you kept a relatively small, and then you mobilized people. It was called that, mobilization, for the war when it became necessary. The technology was such, and the American hysteria after the war was such, that we didn't do it. And then, as Eisenhower told us, you're going to develop, if you have an army this big and it lasts this long, you're going to build your society into a dependence on that. The American military long ago understood it needs to locate its bases. It needs to locate its suppliers all over the country, so all of those people will make sure that the senator and the congressman or women from that area support the budget, because that's what comes back and keeps their neighborhood employed. And so you have the industrial military complex organized to keep this going. You can see the power of that because it's become the model for others. We have a medical industrial complex. Hospitals, doctors, medical insurers, drug companies, they've gotten together just like the military and hammer it, which is why we spend not only more than any other part of the world on military. For all of you who don't know, the United States spends more on the military than the next 9 countries together, which includes Russia and China, spend. And the same thing with medical. We spend 18% of our GDP for medical care. No other country comes even close to spending that kind of money. They are able to get that because they have built themselves into the fabric of this economy, so it can't afford not to do it. That's why the end of the Cold War means nothing. They can't stop. They have to find the next Cold War. And so it's a universal, endless war on terror. That'll do. If you haven't got the Russians there, then hate the terrorists. And if that becomes funny because it doesn't seem to matter, then imagine caravans from Honduras. Those desperately poor people are a danger to this country. But here's the solemn thing to keep in your mind. When you go back and you study Germany, it was the most culturally developed country in Europe. It's the land of Brahms, Beethoven, Bach, Goethe. My God, what society they were able to develop. And yet, under pressure of a capitalism that broke down in 1929, they were able, in their fantasy, to imagine that the whole world was after them. They became paranoid on a scale that is incredible. They killed unspeakable numbers of people in a kind of methodical, elimination of other members of our own species that we've never seen before. And if you think that's peculiar to the Germans, you're wrong. That is the same mentality, and I say this using my Marxism, that can watch immigrant children be put in cages and think that somehow that's necessary, that somehow that's reasonable. That is extraordinary. That's an extraordinary cultural moment. And it tells you nothing about the children or the cages or immigration. It tells you about the mentality of a large part of this country is so upset by what they're going through. They don't have the vocabulary or the history or the help to identify what their problem is. But they are unspeakably angry and therefore immune to the kinds of appeals that normally would have reached them through their church, through their own thinking, through what, all dead. It is many times, particularly in the Midwest and the South, the church members who are foaming at the mouth about this stuff, who talk about Christian charity and family values on Sunday and then cheer those children in the cages on Monday. That's an amazing achievement. There's no psychic dissonance for these people. There's no bell goes off about something wrong in this picture. That's a sign of deep distress. When you hear the President of the United States say, I've got the greatest economy in the world, you're living in a time warp. We have an opioid crisis that is killing 70,000 to 80,000 people a year in this country. That's way more than the wars kill us. We have a suicide rate that's off the chart. This is a disaster, what's unfolding in this country, and there's no end. The inequality gets worse. The policies to make it worse are still in place. There's no self-reflection that this can't go on. And there's no systemic awareness that there even is a system that could be otherwise. Capitalism is the end. It's what we all are. It's like Mrs. Pelosi said, remember a year or two ago when a student asked her a question, what about the socialism and capitalism? She couldn't understand what he was talking about, and she looked befuddled at him, and she said in those famous words, we're all capitalists. Exactly.